So, lately I found myself going down a rather interesting rabbit hole. As a little bit of escapism from the present in 2025, I've been reading through some old newspapers. Newspapers from 100 years ago, to be exact. It's absolutely delightful. So I figured it might be fun to share what I find with all of you. If it interests you, come join me and we'll explore some long forgotten places, tell stories not heard for decades, and paint a portrait of life a century ago with spun yarns of yesteryear. Here is what was in the news the first week of January, 1925. Our first story begins off the coast of Atlantic City, New Jersey, when the U.S. Coast Guard seized a bootlegger ship called the Kate C. These rum runners had in their possession 1,000 cases of rum and 600 cases of Scotch whiskey, or, as the Peninsula Enterprise called it, 600 cases of holiday cheer. This was, at the time, the largest quantity of liquor ever seized by the Coast Guard, and was valued at $50,000. Or in today's money, that's closer to $900,000. You can certainly have a rather cheerful holiday for $900,000. E.R. Grinolds of near Parksley, Virginia, reports the best weight for 9 turkeys shipped during the Christmas season just past. He dressed 4 hens and 5 toms, and their net weight was 144 pounds and 10 ounces. Mr. Grinolds says it pays to raise true bronze turkeys. That's an average weight of 16 pounds per turkey, though not to take away from E.R. Grinolds' impressive feat. 100 years in the future, the average weight of a Thanksgiving turkey is closer to 30 pounds. I'm not sure how a 1920s poultry farmer would react to one of these modern-day selectively bred crimes against nature, but suffice to say, a few 16-pounders was worthy of the news back then, and I'd like to formally congratulate Mr. Grinolds on his accomplishment. Coming from Paris, Arkansas, we have a story about a man who appears to have made the papers solely because of his name. And let me tell you, it's a beaut. Summoned at Burton, a man stated that his name was Bertram Abiff Wellborn Montague Thomas William Henry Lawrence Dupemiduke Simpson Hudson. Absolute perfection, no notes. Also in Paris, Arkansas, it seems like you have 2 options for your local dentist. There's the redundantly named Dr. D.R. Thompson, located above the American Bank and Trust, and there's Dr. R.B. Sadler, located above the First National Bank. It seems, for expediency purposes, all banking and dentistry in Paris, Arkansas is to be done in one go. According to press dispatchers, there are rumors spreading from Bucharest, Bessarabia, and Berlin that Soviet revolutionary and Minister of War Leon Trotsky, pictured here alive in 1936, has been assassinated. Completely crushed, as the Daily Telegraph's correspondent says. This news, I'm sure, came as a great surprise to Mr. Trotsky, who would indeed face an assassination, but not for another 15 years. Excellent news on the medical front this week. Dr. Edward C. Rosenau has announced that he has found the cause and will soon have the cure for a terrible plague that has scourged humanity for millennia. Hiccups. According to Dr. Rosenau, hiccups are caused by a round germ that throws off a poison that acts on the central nervous system. It's truly wonderful to think that 1925 was the year that we solved hiccups for good, and that affliction is with us no more. And in local news, Mrs. Jane C. Melson, who has been ill, is better. Cheers to you and your continued good health, Mrs. Melson. Speaking of good health, John Morin of Victory, Vermont, turned 109 years old. He celebrated his birthday by chopping some wood and, presumably, expending a considerable amount of air trying to blow out all of his birthday candles. Mr. Morton claims to have been born in 1816. Happy belated birthday, Mr. Morin. Up in Silver Lake, Wisconsin, Grandma Schmalfelt was at Christmas dinner and a guest at the home of Mr. and Mrs. G. Schmalfelt. I am pleased to report something that you, me, and Grandma Schmalfelt hopefully would all agree upon. Baked potatoes are very acceptable. Very acceptable indeed. As a brief aside, I'd like you all to meet the Professor, the smartest dog in all of Atlantic City. In what very well may be my favorite news story of the week, John R. Stacy, a Marblehead lobsterman, has made friends with a seagull. According to the Boston Globe, this seagull accompanies Mr. Stacy to inspect his lobster traps and will eat fish right out of his hands. But this gull is a jealous gull and will actively chase away other birds that are inclined to make friends with Mr. Stacy. A bit of jealousy, I suppose, is for the birds. Good news for automobile lovers out there. Glowing accounts have been received by relatives of Mr. and Mrs. E.P. Holbrook and Mr. and Mrs. Tuttle, who managed to drive all the way from Hartford, Connecticut to St. Petersburg, Florida in just 8 days. And they only got one tire puncture along the way. If travel by car isn't your cup of tea, there is news in regards to the rapidly advancing field of aviation. Airplane builders are now aiming for a lofty goal of achieving a top speed of 300 miles per hour. At the time that article was written, the airspeed record stood at a commendable 266 miles per hour. Today, the record stands only about 5,000 miles per hour faster than that. In military news, the United States Army announced the promotion of the youngest ever Major General to their ranks. At just 44 years old, A1 Brigadier General Douglas MacArthur will soon be promoted to Major General. I suppose we will just have to wait and see where his career goes. It seems bookkeepers in France forgot about $3 billion worth of loans owed to the United States government. I plan to try a similar strategy with my student loans, and I will report back with the results. The Austrian-American composer Hugo Reisenfeld wrote an article titled Music as a Vocation for Americans, where he contends that only Americans can play jazz. He says, quote, "Other nations have been caught by the contagion of jazz and have tried to adopt it, but without success. There is nothing more pathetic than to hear European orchestras trying to imitate American rhythm. They play it in perfectly counted time just as they would faultlessly play an overture or symphony. The effect is much like watching a tennis match played with dead balls." And while this sentiment is certainly not true in today's world, I myself personally know a great deal of fantastic jazz musicians not originating from the United States. Perhaps it was a bit more true in 1925. It'd still be a few years before Django Reinhardt and other homegrown European luminaries made it onto the scene and livened up their balls considerably. One of the most devastating film reviews I've ever read starts off in a rather self-congratulatory tone, titled A Pretty Good Criticism of a Pretty Poor Picture. The movie in question is a Western cattle drive film called Sundown. The critic here, George Mitchell, says that, quote, "You might say that Sundown is a good picture, but you'd be telling an awful whopper. Take the cows out and the whole thing evaporates like milk. Gross. There isn't anything else in the picture but a few indifferent actors who wander around the great open spaces as thoroughly at sea as the cows that watch them. I'd gladly tell you the story, only there isn't one. Yes, there is, and it's this, briefly. 55,000 cows go to Texas." Now, from what I've been able to gather after doing some digging online is all copies of Sundown are believed to have been lost to time. The very sparse Wikipedia entry on the film says Sundown was universally well received, and clearly the writers of that Wikipedia article never asked noted bovinophobe George Mitchell. Now, the last story I have for you this week tells of a proper way to ring in the new year. It seems not a single noise-making device in all of Winslow, Arizona, remained quiet at midnight, much to the dismay of curmudgeons, crosspatches, and sourpusses everywhere. Thanks for watching, and have a newsworthy day. So, as a little addendum here, this is a project that has been bouncing around in my head for a little while now. If you all liked it, I think I'll make more, as it was a genuine joy to make. I do all of the research, recording, and editing myself, which involves sifting through mountains of old newspapers, pictures, interviews, and more. And my biggest resource for this, by far, is the incredible public domain archive of the Library of Congress. Just stumbling around that archive is how I got the idea for this whole project in the first place. I encourage everyone here to take a look. It's free, and it's yours to enjoy. I'd also say consider donating to them as well. They're not paying me to say that or anything. I just think preserving things like what you saw here is incredibly worthwhile. And that's all. Have a nice day, friends.